What if the most damaging moment in Prince Harry's life didn't happen in front of a camera, but on a page he signed without fully understanding how long it would follow him? That sounds dramatic. I know. And normally, that kind of line would make me instinctively slow down, double-check myself, maybe even throw it away. Because royal stories are full of exaggeration. They thrive on hindsight. Everyone suddenly knew all along. But this time feels different. Unsettlingly different. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because over the past few days, something subtle happened. Not a scandal explosion. Not a screaming headline. Just a few carefully chosen words spoken on live television by someone who does not speak carelessly. Someone who has spent decades saying less than he knows and letting that silence do the work. And when you line those words up against what we've been watching unfold around Prince Harry, the isolation, the financial stress, the increasingly erratic public posture, the silence from institutions that once protected him, a new question starts to form. Not is the marriage in trouble, but what if the marriage is doing exactly what it was designed to do? I want to be very clear about something at the outset. This is not a gossip recap. This is not a relationship autopsy. And it's not about assigning cartoon villain roles. If anything, what makes this story disturbing is how ordinary it starts to look once you slow it down. Because contracts don't scream. They don't leak emotions. They don't give interviews. They sit quietly in the background, shaping behavior, closing doors, narrowing options, long before anyone realizes they're trapped. And the reason this matters right now, not 5 years ago, not at the wedding, not at the Oprah interview, is because we're no longer watching a couple in conflict. We're watching a man whose range of movement appears to be shrinking in real time. Fewer allies, fewer platforms, fewer credible exits. Ask yourself something honestly. When was the last time Prince Harry looked like someone who had options? Not theoretical options. Not he could do this if he wanted to. Real ones. Backed by money, support, legal safety, and reputation. It's been a while. And yet, despite constant rumors, despite visible strain, despite what looks like emotional exhaustion bordering on collapse, there is no divorce filing. No separation announcement. No clean break. That's not normal. High-conflict celebrity marriages end loudly. Fast. Through lawyers who leak aggressively and PR teams that posture for advantage. This one hasn't. Instead, we're seeing something slower. More controlled. Almost procedural. Which brings us to the part no one seems comfortable discussing out loud. What if Prince Harry isn't staying because he wants to, but because leaving would cost him everything he has left? That's not a claim. It's a question. And it's one worth asking, especially in light of what was hinted at recently on live television. The segment itself passed quickly. Most viewers missed it. There was no dramatic pause, no breaking news banner. Just a measured remark about agreements. About leverage. About consequences that outlast relationships. And for anyone familiar with how power actually operates, not in fairy tales, but in law offices, that was enough. Because contracts don't care about love. They care about enforceability. And enforceability, especially across borders, across jurisdictions, across reputations, can quietly dismantle a life without ever needing to raise its voice. Here's where things get uncomfortable. For years, the public story has been framed around choice. Harry chose to leave royal life, chose to speak out, chose to build something new, chose love over duty. And maybe, at the beginning, that was true. But choice has a half-life, especially when it collides with legal structures designed to outlast emotion. At some point, choice becomes momentum. Momentum becomes obligation. And obligation becomes confinement. What we're seeing now doesn't look like a man exercising freedom. It looks like a man managing damage. Carefully. Poorly at times. Desperately, even. The speeches feel thinner. The projects less convincing. The anger more raw, less strategic. There's a sense of someone reacting rather than shaping events. Someone boxed in, lashing out at shadows because the real walls are invisible. And this is where the alleged contract comes in. Not as a sensational document, but as a framework. A framework that, if it exists in the form insiders suggest, explains several things that otherwise don't make sense. Why public criticism flows mostly in one direction. Why silence seems compulsory rather than chosen. Why financial pressure appears chronic rather than transitional. Why reconciliation with the royal family remains frozen despite obvious personal cost. Because here's the thing people misunderstand about modern power dynamics. You don't need to dominate someone loudly if you can constrain them quietly. You don't need to win public arguments if the other person can't afford to speak freely. You don't need to leave a marriage if staying serves your strategic position better. And if that sounds cold, it's because contracts are cold. They're not emotional instruments. They're mechanical ones. This is where I need to slow down again. Because none of this works unless one crucial condition is met. Consent. For any agreement to hold, Harry would have had to sign willingly. No gun to his head. No obvious coercion. Which means, if this structure exists, it likely arrived disguised as protection, stability, safety, love, even. That's how these things usually work. People don't sign traps. They sign solutions. And then, years later, they realize the solution only worked in one direction. Think about the timing. Think about the context in which such an agreement would have been presented. A man estranged from his family, under relentless media pressure, convinced the institution he grew up in had failed him. Newly married, newly relocated, trying to build a life in a country where he had no deep legal or financial infrastructure of his own. That is not a position of strength. That is a position where you reach for certainty, for clarity, for something that feels solid. And contracts feel solid, especially when the person presenting them frames them as mutual, fair, necessary, especially when you're told they protect both sides equally. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't learn until it's too late. The most dangerous contracts are the ones that don't explode immediately. They sit there, quiet, seemingly irrelevant, until the moment you try to leave. Then suddenly, everything you assumed you could do, you can't. You can't speak freely. You can't move money easily. You can't reposition your image without consequences. You can't even signal distress without triggering penalties. And the public never sees this part. They just see behavior, meltdowns, contradictions, bitterness. They assume weakness, or immaturity, or guilt. But what if it's something else? What if we're watching the psychological toll of a man who knows that every move he makes tightens the net further? This would also explain another puzzling aspect of the story. Why doesn't Meghan need to do anything? No filing, no threats, no escalation. If the structure already favors her position, action becomes unnecessary. Silence becomes power. Time becomes leverage. Meanwhile, Harry burns resources trying to outrun a mechanism that was never designed to chase him quickly, just steadily. This isn't about demonizing anyone. It's about understanding incentives. And right now, the incentives appear grotesquely misaligned. Harry looks like someone who cannot afford to break character. Meghan looks like someone who doesn't need to. The media treats this as personality, as temperament, as optics. But optics don't explain legal inertia. Contracts do. Which brings us back to that live television moment. That brief, carefully worded hint. The suggestion that something binding exists beneath the noise. Because journalists like Tom Bauer don't speculate casually on live air. They signal, especially when saying more would cross legal lines. And when someone like that stops just short of a conclusion, it's usually because the conclusion is too dangerous to state plainly. Not dangerous emotionally, dangerous legally. So here's the question that should be sitting with you now. If this alleged divorce contract, or marriage agreement, or post-royal settlement framework is real, and if it operates the way sources suggest, what happens when Harry finally tries to step outside it? Not in theory. In reality. What triggers? What collapses? What gets taken away? Because the most chilling possibility isn't that he loses a marriage. It's that he already lost his future the moment he signed something he thought would save him. And if that's true, then what we're watching now isn't a breakdown. It's the slow realization of a mistake that can't be undone quickly. But the truly disturbing part? We may still be in the early stages. Because what comes next? What happens when pressure, money, reputation, and time all converge, is where contracts stop being abstract and start destroying lives. And that's where this story really begins. The moment didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic sting, no studio gasp, no producer scrambling to cut to commercial. It passed the way uncomfortable truths often do, quietly, almost politely, wrapped in language that only lands if you're listening for what isn't being said. It happened on live television. A short exchange, measured, controlled, and if you weren't already paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. But if you followed the work of Tom Bauer long enough, you know something about how he operates. He doesn't speculate for sport. He doesn't throw accusations into the air to see what sticks. When he speaks publicly, especially in real time, every word is weighed against legal consequence. Every pause matters. Every omission is intentional. Which is why this moment deserves far more scrutiny than it's received. Because what he didn't say, what he stopped just short of articulating, is where the story actually lives. The question he was responding to wasn't even framed dramatically. It was one of those broad, almost lazy prompts broadcasters use when they want an opinion without inviting liability. Something about the state of the Sussex marriage. Something about whether things were as bad as they seem. And Bauer didn't bite. Not in the way tabloids would have hoped. Instead, he shifted the frame. He talked about agreements. About arrangements made earlier than people realize. About consequences that don't require public action to remain effective. He used the kind of language that sounds benign until you replay it in your head later and realize it reorders everything you thought you understood. Agreements. Arrangements. Consequences. None of those words belong to romance. They belong to law offices. And that's when the atmosphere subtly changed. Because once you hear a relationship discussed in those terms, not love, not conflict, not betrayal, but structure, you're no longer in the realm of gossip. You're in the realm of leverage. Here's the thing about live television. It's not where you go to disclose sensitive legal realities. It's where you hint at them, where you test how much the audience is prepared to hear, where you speak in a register that protects you while alerting those who know how to read between the lines. And Bauer knows exactly who his audience is when he does that. Not casual viewers, not social media commentators, but people who understand how power actually functions when it's written down and signed. So let's slow this moment down. He wasn't talking about a divorce filing. He wasn't even talking about separation. He was talking about a pre-existing framework that governs what can and cannot happen next. That's a critical distinction. Because divorces are events. Contracts are systems. An event happens once. A system operates continuously. And if Prince Harry is caught inside a system he no longer controls, then the absence of visible action suddenly makes sense. Think about the way Harry has behaved publicly over the last 2 years. Not the headlines, the patterns, the impulsive interviews, the scattered messaging, the sense of grievance that never quite lands where it's aimed, the oscillation between defiance and vulnerability, the constant return to the same unresolved wounds. This doesn't look like someone preparing to leave. It looks like someone under constraint. When people are free, their narratives expand. They explore new ground. They take risks. They reposition themselves. Harry's narrative has narrowed. It circles the same themes, the same enemies, the same justifications, almost as if stepping outside those boundaries would trigger consequences he can't afford. And this is where Bauer's comments become less abstract and more chilling. Because when an investigative journalist starts talking about agreements instead of emotions, he's pointing you away from personality and toward paperwork. Paperwork doesn't care about public sympathy. Paperwork doesn't care about mental health narratives. Paperwork only cares about compliance. Let's ask a hard question that no one on television is asking out loud. If Harry were truly free to leave, legally, financially, reputationally, would he still be here? Would he still be locked in public silence on certain topics while others dominate his messaging? Would he still appear so reactive, so defensive, so oddly constrained in what he can and cannot say? Or would we have seen a clean break by now? High-profile divorces do not linger in this ambiguous middle space unless there's a reason. And that reason is almost always leverage. Now, I want to be careful here. Because it's easy to slip into caricature. To assume one person is masterminding everything while the other is oblivious. Reality is rarely that clean. But power doesn't require malice to be effective. It only requires asymmetry. And asymmetry is exactly what appears to be at play. Consider the silence. Not just from Harry. From everyone around him. The royal family has closed ranks, but not in the way people expected. There's no public condemnation. No overt rescue attempt. No visible intervention. That's not indifference. That's caution. Institutions don't stay quiet unless speaking would make things worse. And if there is a binding agreement in place, one that involves jurisdictional complexities, media constraints, or financial penalties, then any outside interference could trigger clauses no one wants activated. This is how contracts enforce themselves, not through threats, but through anticipation. You don't need to pull the lever if everyone knows what happens when you do. This is also why Bauer's phrasing mattered so much. He wasn't accusing. He was contextualizing. He was suggesting that the game was set up long before the audience realized they were watching it. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. If this agreement exists in the way insiders imply, then it likely predates many of the public moments we've been analyzing as turning points. The interviews, the memoir, the public grievances. Those may not have been acts of rebellion. They may have been acts of pressure. Because when someone can't leave, they often try to renegotiate through noise, through visibility, through emotional leverage. They try to make the cost of containment too high. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, the fallout is brutal. Let's talk about timing for a moment. Why now? Why is this coming up again, years after the wedding, years after the move to California, years after the initial break with the royal family? Because leverage ages. Contracts don't just sit there unchanged. Their effects compound. Financial obligations accumulate. Reputational pathways narrow. Public goodwill erodes. What might have seemed manageable in year 1 becomes suffocating in year 5. And if Harry is approaching a point where the long-term cost of staying exceeds the immediate cost of leaving, even with penalties, that's when cracks start to show. That's when journalists start hinting. That's when silence becomes conspicuous. And that's when you see behavior that looks irrational on the surface, but makes sense under constraint. Think about how often Harry appears to be arguing with ghosts, with narratives that no longer dominate public discourse, with institutions that have already moved on. That's what happens when the real problem isn't the audience. It's the agreement behind the scenes. You can't fight a contract publicly. You can only endure it, or break it and accept the consequences. And breaking it is rarely as simple as people think, especially when the contract is designed to protect one party's image while restricting the others. Especially when one side has jurisdictional advantage. Especially when children, money, and reputation are all entangled. Which brings us back to that live television moment. Why would Bauer choose that platform, that timing, to raise this issue, indirectly? Because live television offers plausible deniability. He can say he was speaking generally, about dynamics, about patterns. But those who know what to listen for heard the signal. Something is locked in place. And it's not love. Here's another uncomfortable question. What if the reason there's been no divorce announcement isn't indecision, but impossibility? Not absolute impossibility. Conditional impossibility. As in, you can leave, but only if you're willing to lose things you can't afford to lose. Your remaining income streams. Your ability to tell your side of the story. Your standing in future legal battles. Your proximity to your children. That kind of leverage doesn't require daily enforcement. It enforces itself. And if Harry is caught inside that, then every public appearance, every strained smile, every angry aside starts to look different. Not as entitlement, but as panic, which reframes Meghan's position as well, not as overt aggression, but as strategic stillness. You don't move when the board already favors you. You wait. You let the other side exhaust itself. You let time do what confrontation doesn't need to. And this is why the story isn't loud yet. Because it doesn't need to be. But it's also why the stakes are rising. Because systems like this don't collapse gracefully. They break under pressure. And when they do, the damage is rarely confined to one person. So when you hear a seasoned journalist like Tom Bauer carefully allude to agreements on live television, understand what that means. It means he's pointing you toward a mechanism he can't fully describe yet. It means he's warning, not revealing. And it means the situation is far more serious than a troubled marriage. Because the most dangerous traps are the ones that don't look like traps at all, until you try to walk away. And if Harry does try to walk away, the next phase of this story won't be about emotions, or interviews, or public sympathy. It will be about enforcement. And once enforcement begins, there's no going back. If you're looking for the moment where this turns from a love story into something else, you won't find it in photographs or speeches. You won't find it in public rows or awkward silences on balconies. You'll find it in language, in clauses, in the quiet shift from promises to protections. Because here's the first misconception we need to dismantle. Whatever Harry signed, if he signed what multiple sources suggest, it wasn't a divorce contract. Not in the way people imagine. Not a document that sits in a drawer waiting for a marriage to fail. That kind of paperwork is crude, reactive, almost old-fashioned. This was something else entirely. A framework, a containment strategy, a structure designed not to end a relationship, but to govern it indefinitely. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Let me explain why. Traditional prenups are defensive. They're built around assets, inheritance, separation scenarios. They assume a future rupture and try to manage damage when it happens. But modern power agreements, especially in celebrity, politics, and high-stakes branding, aren't built around rupture. They're built around control. Control of narrative. Control of timing. Control of silence. They don't ask, what happens if we split? They ask, what must never happen, no matter what? And if Harry walked into this arrangement believing he was securing peace, stability, and mutual protection, he wouldn't have been unusual. He would have been predictable. Because when people feel hunted by media, by family expectations, by history itself, they crave certainty. They crave boundaries. They crave something that says, here is where the chaos stops. Contracts offer that illusion beautifully, especially when they're presented not as weapons, but as shields. Think back to that period. Harry wasn't just in love. He was at war with his own past, with the institution he came from, with a press culture he believed had destroyed his mother. He wasn't thinking like a strategist. He was thinking like someone desperate to escape. And desperate people don't negotiate. They accept. They accept assurances. They accept framing. They accept language that sounds reasonable because it promises safety. This is how containment strategies are sold, not as cages. As lifeboats, you're told it protects both of you. You're told it keeps things fair. You're told it prevents future misunderstandings. You're told it stops external forces from exploiting your relationship. All true. Technically, what you're not told, or what you don't hear, is that it also centralizes power, that it locks in asymmetry, that it defines who gets to speak, when, and at what cost. And once you've agreed to that, the relationship no longer exists in a vacuum. It exists inside a system. This is where the public narrative starts to mislead. People assume the marriage itself is the battlefield, that arguments, resentment, and emotional fractures are the main drivers. But systems don't care about feelings. They care about compliance. And compliance doesn't require happiness. It requires fear of consequence. So let's look at what a containment strategy typically includes. Not hypothetically, but based on patterns seen again and again in high-profile cases. First, silence clauses. Not just non-disclosure, but non-disparagement. Carefully worded. Broad enough to discourage even indirect criticism. Ambiguous enough to make legal advice conservative. The effect? Self-censorship. You don't need to be told, you can't say this. You just need to be unsure whether you can. Second, reputational asymmetry. One party's image is protected as a primary asset. The other's is treated as collateral. Not destroyed, just expendable. This doesn't mean smear campaigns. It means narrative imbalance. One side can reposition. The other must remain reactive. Third, financial entanglement without liquidity. Money exists, but access is conditional. Streams are tied to compliance, brand alignment, and public posture. You're not broke, but you're never comfortable. And fourth, the most powerful component, timing control. Who acts first? Who files? Who speaks? Who waits? The party with timing control doesn't need to move. They just need to let the other person move incorrectly. Now, apply this framework to what we've actually observed. Harry talks. A lot. Sometimes too much. He overexplains. He revisits old grievances. He seems compelled to justify himself, again and again, as if trying to fill a silence he can't escape. Meghan doesn't. She appears. Strategically. Selectively. Often in contexts that reinforce victimhood or virtue, but rarely in situations that invite direct scrutiny. That's not temperament. That's positioning. One side feels the need to explain. The other doesn't. And that's usually a sign of who is constrained. Here's another detail that doesn't get enough attention. When couples genuinely prepare for separation, they start untangling. Financially, publicly, logistically. We haven't seen that. We've seen projects announced and quietly fade. Deals rumored and restructured. Legal battles that drain resources without yielding leverage. That's not preparation. That's stagnation. which suggests the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Keep everything just functional enough to prevent decisive action. This is where the word containment becomes unavoidable. Because containment doesn't require dominance. It requires patience. You don't force someone to stay. You make leaving too expensive. An expense doesn't just mean money. It means reputation, access, voice, credibility. Imagine being told, implicitly, that if you step out of line, the version of the story that survives will not be yours. Not because someone will attack you, but because you won't be able to respond. That kind of silence is terrifying, especially for someone whose entire public identity has been built around telling his side of the story. Now, let's address the obvious objection. Why would Harry agree to something like this? Because he didn't think he was agreeing to that. He thought he was agreeing to protection, to mutual respect, to a boundary against the very forces he feared most. And again, this isn't stupidity. It's human. People don't sign away autonomy because they're foolish. They do it because they're afraid. Afraid of losing love. Afraid of losing identity. Afraid of losing safety. And if the person across the table understands that fear, truly understands it, they don't need to threaten. They just need to reassure. That's how asymmetry is born. It starts with trust, and then it calcifies into structure. The most chilling aspect of this isn't that Harry may be unhappy. It's that his unhappiness may be irrelevant to the system he's in. Because systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to breach. And breach is expensive. This also reframes something else that's been bothering observers for years. Why does Harry keep returning to the same emotional wells? The same childhood trauma. The same press grievances. The same institutional betrayals. It's as if he's stuck in a loop. That's not because he hasn't healed. It's because he can't move forward. Forward movement would require narrative independence. And narrative independence might violate the very framework he's operating under. So he circles. He vents where he's allowed to. He lashes out where it's safe. He avoids the areas that feel strangely off-limits. Those off-limits areas are the real story. And they're precisely where a containment strategy would be focused. Now, here's where things get even more unsettling. Containment agreements aren't meant to last forever. They're meant to last until the balance of power is irreversible. Until time, money, and credibility shift so decisively that escape becomes theoretical. At that point, the agreement doesn't need to be enforced aggressively. It has already done its job, which raises a difficult question. Are we watching that process nearing completion? Harry's public credibility has eroded. His financial independence appears strained. His institutional allies are distant. His options are narrowing. That doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when every misstep compounds. And the most dangerous thing about containment is that it often feels like your own fault. You blame yourself for speaking too much, for choosing the wrong project, for trusting the wrong people. You don't see the architecture. You just feel the walls closing in. This is why Bauer's live television comments matter so much. Because he didn't say Harry is trapped. He said something far more precise. He alluded to agreements made earlier than people think. Agreements whose consequences persist regardless of emotion. That's a journalist pointing to structure, not drama. And structure is harder to dismantle than any relationship. So when you hear people ask, why doesn't Harry just leave? Understand how naive that question is. Leaving isn't a door. It's a sequence that requires money, silence, legal safety, and reputational control, all at the same time. Miss one, and the cost multiplies. And if the agreement was designed to ensure you miss at least one, then staying starts to look like the only survivable option. For now. But containment has a weakness. Time cuts both ways. And systems built to restrain eventually reveal their pressure points. The question isn't whether this framework can hold indefinitely. It's what happens when the person inside it stops caring about the consequences. Because that's when containment turns into conflict. And conflict, once it breaks the surface, never stays quiet for long. There's a comforting myth people cling to when they watch powerful figures unravel. That at any moment, they can just walk away, pack a bag, call a lawyer, disappear into a new chapter. It's a myth that survives because it feels fair, because it reassures us that no matter how bad things get, autonomy always exists somewhere, waiting to be claimed. But autonomy is not a given. It's a resource. And like any resource, it can be depleted. If you want to understand Prince Harry's current position, You have to abandon the idea that exit is a single decision. It isn't. Exit is a chain reaction, and every link in that chain has to hold. Money, jurisdiction, narrative control, legal safety, psychological stamina. Miss one, and the illusion of freedom collapses. This is where the story becomes less emotional and more mechanical. And frankly, more unsettling. Because on paper, Harry appears to have options. Wealth, connections, name recognition, global sympathy. People look at that list and assume mobility. But options that exist on paper don't always translate into options that exist in reality, especially when those options are conditional. Think about how often Harry has spoken publicly about wanting to tell his truth. How central that phrase has been to his identity over the past few years. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. What if telling his truth is precisely the one thing he can't afford to do freely anymore? That's not a rhetorical flourish. That's a structural problem. Because if your sense of self is built around speaking, around explanation, confession, accusation, and you suddenly find yourself constrained, the psychological pressure is enormous. You don't just lose a voice. You lose orientation. This helps explain something that has confused even sympathetic observers. Why does Harry keep oversharing, but never on the parts people are most curious about? Why does he speak endlessly about his past, but almost never with clarity about his present? Why do his interviews feel emotionally raw but strategically hollow? It's as if he's allowed to talk, but only in directions that don't threaten the underlying structure he's operating within. That's not freedom. That's managed expression. And managed expression creates a very specific kind of frustration. You can talk, but you can't resolve. You can vent, but you can't move on. So you circle. You repeat. You escalate tone instead of content. You push harder against walls that don't budge. This is what an illusion of exit looks like from the inside. From the outside, people say, why doesn't he just stop talking? From the inside, silence feels like suffocation. Now layer in the financial reality. Harry may not be poor, not in the conventional sense, but liquidity matters more than net worth. Cash flow matters more than assets. And control matters more than numbers on a spreadsheet. If income streams are tied to brand alignment, public posture, and contractual compliance, then money becomes another form of leash. You're not broke. You're just never secure. Every legal challenge drains resources. Every PR misstep narrows opportunities. Every failed project weakens negotiating position. And suddenly, the idea of walking away from a system that still pays you, even imperfectly, feels reckless. This is why high-conflict separations often involve explosive spending. Because one side is trying to bleed the other dry before escape becomes impossible. But here, we don't see that. We see slow attrition. Legal fees without decisive outcomes. Projects announced without follow-through. Public goodwill eroding without replacement. That's not a strategy aimed at victory. That's survival under constraint. And then there's jurisdiction. This is the part that rarely makes headlines, but it's where power quietly consolidates. Where are disputes resolved? Which courts have authority? Which laws apply? These questions matter more than emotion ever will. If Harry's legal exposure spans multiple jurisdictions, the UK, the US, possibly others, then every move has to be filtered through a matrix of risk. You don't just ask, can I say this? You ask, where can this be used against me? That kind of constant calculation is exhausting. It breeds paranoia. It erodes confidence. It also explains why Harry's behavior sometimes feels erratic. Because when you're operating under layered constraints, spontaneity becomes dangerous. And yet, repression eventually explodes. So you get oscillation, careful silence, followed by emotional outbursts, calculated restraint, followed by impulsive disclosure. From the outside, it looks inconsistent. From the inside, it's the rhythm of someone testing boundaries they can't see clearly anymore. And this brings us to the most misunderstood aspect of Harry's situation. The idea that he's staying because he wants to. Desire is irrelevant in systems like this. What matters is cost-benefit analysis. And the cost of exit appears staggeringly high. Imagine being told, again, not explicitly, but structurally, that leaving will trigger a cascade you cannot control. Your ability to fund your life independently will shrink. Your access to your children may become complicated. Your reputation will be defined by narratives you can't respond to fully. Your credibility will be questioned precisely because you're silent. That's not a choice between happiness and unhappiness. That's a choice between different kinds of loss. And when people are forced into that position, they often delay. They hope something external will change. That time will improve their leverage. They wait. Waiting is not passive. It's strategic, but it's also corrosive. Because while you wait, the system continues to operate. Public sympathy fades. Allies move on. The world grows tired of your story. And the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to reintroduce yourself as something new. This is why exit windows matter, and why missing them is devastating. Harry may have had an exit window at one point, early on, before narratives calcified, before financial dependencies deepened, before credibility eroded. If that window existed, it appears to have closed quietly, not with a bang, with a shrug. Now, any attempt to leave would be reframed not as liberation, but as failure. And failure is far more expensive than departure. This is where the illusion of exit fully collapses. Because once leaving costs more than staying, emotionally, financially, reputationally, staying becomes the rational choice, even if it's miserable. That's not weakness. That's math. But math doesn't care about long-term psychological damage. It doesn't care about identity erosion. It doesn't care about resentment building under the surface. It just balances inputs and outputs. And right now, the outputs of leaving appear catastrophic. Which brings us back to the strange stillness on the other side of this equation. If Harry is constrained, what does that say about Meghan's position? It suggests she doesn't need to move. She doesn't need to escalate. She doesn't need to file. She doesn't need to provoke. Because the system already does the work. And in systems like this, the party with the least urgency holds the most power. Urgency is weakness. Harry has urgency. You can hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes, feel it in his pacing. Meghan doesn't. That asymmetry tells you almost everything you need to know. But here's the part that should really make you pause. Illusions of exit don't just trap people physically. They trap them psychologically. You start believing that every bad outcome is your fault. That if you just said the right thing, chosen the right project, shown the right restraint, things would improve. You internalize the failure, and that makes you easier to control. Because once you blame yourself, you stop questioning the structure. You stop asking whether the game was rigged. You just try harder to win it. This is why the public narrative around Harry's self-destruction is so misleading. It assumes agency where there may be constraint. It assumes freedom where there may be compliance. And it ignores the possibility that what looks like chaos is actually the byproduct of a system slowly tightening. Now, here's where this chapter has to end on an uncomfortable note. Illusions don't last forever. Eventually, reality intrudes. Either the cost of staying becomes unbearable, or the cost of leaving becomes acceptable. That moment is called a breaking point. And when someone reaches it, they stop calculating. They stop managing. They stop containing themselves. They act. If Harry reaches that point, and all signs suggest he's moving closer to it, the next phase of this story will not be quiet, strategic, or controlled. It will be messy, emotional, and irreversible. Because once someone realizes the exit was never real, they don't walk away. They tear their way out. And when that happens, every clause, every agreement, every silent understanding is suddenly tested under pressure. That's when systems reveal what they're really made of. And that's where the true damage begins. There's a temptation, when watching a relationship stall this publicly, to assume inertia is weakness. That the absence of action means uncertainty, fear, indecision. But that assumption only holds if both sides are equally constrained. They aren't. In fact, the most revealing aspect of this entire situation isn't what Prince Harry is doing. It's what Meghan isn't. No filings. No ultimatums. No public escalation. No visible urgency. And that should bother you. Because in high-conflict situations, stillness is rarely accidental. Stillness is power. Here's the uncomfortable reality most people don't like to confront. The person who doesn't need to act is usually the one winning. Action is expensive. It exposes intent. It triggers clocks. It invites scrutiny. And it opens you up to mistakes. Silence does the opposite. Silence lets the other person reveal themselves. Silence lets pressure accumulate elsewhere. Silence allows time to distort narratives without your fingerprints on them. And if the structure is already tilted in your favor, silence is not avoidance. It's strategy. This is where the idea of never needing to file comes into focus. Because filing for divorce is not a neutral move. It's a declaration. It defines roles. It forces timelines. It creates obligations. If you're holding leverage through existing agreements, filing can actually weaken your position. He's trying to regain agency in a situation where agency may already be constrained. Meanwhile, Meghan's public posture remains controlled, curated, almost serene. That's not emotional detachment. That's structural confidence. Now, let's go one layer deeper, because this is where things get truly unsettling. Silence doesn't just preserve leverage. It compounds it. Every month that passes without a decisive break shifts the balance further. Public sympathy erodes. Harry's credibility diminishes. The narrative hardens. And crucially, any attempt by Harry to change that narrative becomes easier to frame as instability. He speaks. He's spiraling. He lashes out. He's unhinged. He stays quiet. He's guilty. That's a trap. And traps don't require active participation once they're set. This is why the idea of never needing to file is so powerful. Because the goal may never have been divorce. The goal may have been control without rupture. A structure where the relationship remains intact just enough to enforce silence, extract compliance, and prevent independent repositioning. That's not romantic, but it's efficient. And it also explains why certain narratives persist despite evidence to the contrary. Why stories about Harry's mental state dominate coverage. Why questions about Meghan's role are framed as misogyny or bad faith. Why the focus always returns to his behavior, never the system around him. Systems prefer scapegoats. They divert attention from architecture. Now, I want to pause here, because this is where people start to get uncomfortable, where accusations feel implied even when they're not stated. So let's be precise. This isn't about malicious intent. It's about incentives. If a structure exists that benefits one party more than the other, that party doesn't need to be cruel to benefit from it. They just need to not dismantle it. And dismantling it would require action. Filing, speaking, escalating. None of which appear to be happening. Instead, what we see is quiet endurance on one side and visible strain on the other. That asymmetry tells a story all by itself. Here's another detail that rarely gets discussed. Divorce filings create discovery. Discovery is dangerous. Documents get requested. Communications get scrutinized. Timelines get reconstructed. If there are elements of an agreement that work best when they remain abstract, when they're felt rather than examined. Discovery is a risk. Why invite that? Why not let the existing framework do its work quietly, without judicial spotlight? Especially if the other party is already unraveling under the pressure. Now consider the psychological effect of this dynamic. Harry is forced into a paradox. If he stays silent, he feels erased. If he speaks, he risks punishment. That's not indecision. That's paralysis. And paralysis is often mistaken for weakness. But it's actually a sign of containment. Contained people don't make clean exits. They deteriorate. They second-guess. They over-explain. They repeat themselves. They start to look unreliable, which then justifies further containment. It's a self-reinforcing loop. This also reframes something else we've seen repeatedly. Harry's attempts to reframe himself as a humanitarian, an advocate, a thought leader. These aren't random career moves. They're attempts to build an identity that exists outside the system constraining him. But those attempts keep failing. Why? Because identity building requires consistency. And consistency requires autonomy. If you can't fully control your narrative, if parts of your story are off-limits, every reinvention looks hollow. Audiences sense that. They don't know why something feels off. They just know it does. And that discomfort gets attributed to Harry himself, not to the constraints around him, which is exactly how a system like this maintains itself. Now let's talk about the most brutal aspect of silence as power. It's invisible. There's no villain monologue, no smoking gun, no dramatic showdown. Just time. Time doing its work. Time turning early missteps into permanent labels. Time draining energy. Time making alternatives feel unrealistic. And while all of that happens, the person benefiting from the structure doesn't need to lift a finger. They just wait. This is why people asking, why doesn't she just leave him? Are asking the wrong question. The real question is, why would she? What incentive exists to disrupt a system that appears to be functioning exactly as intended? Leaving would create uncertainty. Staying maintains leverage. Leaving would force renegotiation. Staying keeps the rules intact. And as long as the system holds, urgency remains one-sided. Harry is the one aging in public. Harry is the one hemorrhaging credibility. Harry is the one fighting ghosts. That's not accidental. That's how power expresses itself when it's embedded in agreements rather than personalities. But here's the thing about silence. It works until it doesn't. Because silence relies on the other party continuing to care about consequences. It relies on fear, on hope, on restraint. And fear erodes. Hope collapses. Restraint snaps. There comes a moment, always, when the contained person stops calculating and starts acting. Not strategically, not carefully, but emotionally. That's when silence becomes dangerous for the person relying on it. Because when someone no longer cares about penalties, the system loses its grip. And we may be approaching that moment. Harry's tone has shifted. His anger feels less performative, more raw. Less calculated, more desperate. That's not a sign of empowerment. It's a sign of someone nearing the end of endurance. And when endurance ends, people don't file paperwork. They blow things up, which raises a final, unsettling question. If Meghan has never needed to file, what happens when Harry forces the issue in a way that bypasses the system entirely? Not through lawyers, not through negotiations, but through an act that makes silence impossible. Because once silence breaks, every agreement is tested. And some structures don't survive exposure. There's a phrase lawyers use when they want to sound neutral about something deeply unbalanced. They call it risk allocation. It sounds technical, boring even. But in practice, it's the mechanism by which one person absorbs uncertainty while the other is insulated from it. And if you want to understand why Prince Harry looks perpetually exposed while Meghan does not, you have to understand how reputational risk can be distributed deliberately inside an agreement. Because reputation isn't just image. It's currency. It determines who gets believed, who gets platforms, who gets grace when things go wrong. And once reputation becomes contractual, it stops being personal. This is where the idea of a reputational kill switch comes into play. Not in the cinematic sense. Nothing dramatic. No button. No threat. Just a condition. A condition that says, if you cross this line, everything changes. Now, most people imagine reputational clauses as mutual, fair, balanced. We both agree not to disparage each other. That's how they're marketed. But in practice, they're rarely symmetrical. Because one person's reputation is often treated as the primary asset to be preserved, the brand, while the other's is treated as secondary, a supporting narrative, flexible, sacrificial if necessary. You can tell which is which by watching who speaks and who absorbs the fallout. Look at the pattern. Harry speaks. The backlash lands on him. Harry defends himself. The scrutiny intensifies. Harry goes quiet. Speculation fills the vacuum, again about him. Meghan doesn't need to counter. She doesn't need to clarify. She doesn't need to correct. The narrative always resolves in her favor by default. That doesn't happen organically. Not in today's media environment. It happens when the risk has already been pre-assigned. Think about what a reputational kill switch actually does. It doesn't destroy someone outright. That would be obvious. Counterproductive. It makes them radioactive. Suddenly, platforms hesitate. Editors second-guess. Allies distance themselves quietly. Not because of a scandal, but because of uncertainty. No one wants to attach themselves to someone whose story might detonate. And if Harry knows, or even suspects, that crossing certain lines would trigger that kind of fallout, then he's effectively gagged without being silenced explicitly. That's the elegance of it. You don't say, if you talk, we'll ruin you. You just design the environment so that talking ruins you. This explains something that has baffled even seasoned observers. Why does Harry sometimes appear to sabotage himself? Why does he release material that makes him look petty, obsessive, or unstable? Why does he relitigate grievances that no longer earn sympathy? Because he's trying to control a narrative that he can't fully access. He's allowed to speak, but only in ways that don't threaten the protected asset. And that creates distortion. You end up talking around the truth instead of through it. You gesture at the problem without naming it. You lash out at safer targets. That's not incompetence. That's containment leaking. Now, Consider how reputational kill switches interact with modern media ecosystems. News cycles are short, attention is scarce, and audiences are unforgiving. Once someone is framed as unreliable, everything they say is filtered through that assumption. It becomes self-reinforcing. Harry is emotional, therefore irrational. He's angry, therefore biased. He's inconsistent, therefore untrustworthy. Never mind that inconsistency is often the byproduct of constraint. The label sticks. And once it sticks, it doesn't need reinforcement. It does the work on its own. Meanwhile, Meghan benefits from a different framing. She is composed. She is silent. She is dignified. Silence reads as strength when you're not being interrogated. This is where the asymmetry becomes brutal. If Harry tries to reclaim his reputation aggressively, he looks desperate. If he stays quiet, he looks defeated. Either way, his credibility erodes. That's what a reputational kill switch is designed to do. It doesn't require activation. It's always on. And this also sheds light on something else. Why certain topics are completely absent from Harry's public discourse. Not softened. Not reframed. Absent. There are gaps in his storytelling that feel unnatural. Areas he dances around. Questions he never answers directly. Those gaps are where the risk lives. And risk, once assigned to you alone, becomes paralyzing. Because even telling the truth can be punished if it violates the structure. Now let's address the obvious counterargument. If this reputational imbalance exists, why hasn't Harry just gone nuclear? Released everything. Burned it all down. Because scorched earth only works if you're willing to live in the ashes. And Harry doesn't appear ready or able to do that. Why? Because reputational damage isn't evenly survivable. Meghan's brand is built around resilience, victimhood, and moral positioning. Damage can be reframed as persecution. Harry's brand is built around credibility, sincerity, and moral clarity. Damage looks like collapse. One side can absorb chaos. The other can't. That's the difference between being insulated and being exposed. And insulation is rarely accidental. Let's talk about how this kind of reputational leverage is enforced without visible enforcement. Through third parties, legal teams, PR firms, media relationships. Not overt coordination, just alignment. If editors know one side is litigious, they tread carefully. If journalists know certain narratives are protected, they frame cautiously. If sources know speaking risks consequences, they go quiet. And suddenly, one person's version of events becomes the default, not because it's proven, but because it's safer. Harry, by contrast, is treated as a risk. He's volatile, emotional, litigious in unpredictable ways. A source of controversy. So even when he tells the truth, it doesn't land cleanly. Truth requires credibility to function. And credibility is the first casualty of reputational containment. This is why the phrase kill switch is appropriate. Because once triggered, even partially, it shuts down the ability to recover. You can't rebuild credibility while you're still inside the system that undermined it. Every attempt looks like further proof of instability. And the longer this persists, the more isolated the person becomes. Isolation isn't just emotional. It's structural. You lose advisors who challenge you. You lose allies who tell you hard truths. You surround yourself with people who reinforce your grievances instead of helping you escape them. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when dissent becomes dangerous. Now, think about what this does to someone psychologically. You feel misunderstood. You feel misrepresented. You feel silenced without being silenced. And eventually, you start to doubt your own perceptions. You ask yourself whether you're the problem. That's the most effective form of control. Because once someone internalizes blame, they stop resisting. They exhaust themselves trying to fix something that isn't broken in the way they think. And while they do that, time keeps passing. Time that hardens narratives. Time that locks in reputational damage. Time that makes exit harder. This is why reputational kill switches are so devastating. They don't just limit speech. They erode self-trust. They make you hesitate before every word. They make you second-guess every instinct. They make you afraid of your own voice. And if Harry is experiencing that, if he's operating under the constant fear that saying the wrong thing will destroy what little remains of his standing, then his behavior starts to make tragic sense. The anger, the defensiveness, the fixation on past injustices. Those are the last refuges of someone whose present is off limits. But here's the part that shifts this from tragic to dangerous. Reputational kill switches don't just protect one side. They also create pressure for escalation. Because when someone realizes they're losing credibility no matter what they do, the incentive to play it safe disappears. Why protect a reputation that's already compromised? Why self-censor if silence hasn't saved you? That's when people start to take risks they wouldn't have considered before. They leak. They overshare. They act out. Not because they're reckless, but because the cost of restraint has exceeded the cost of exposure. If Harry reaches that point, the reputational system designed to contain him could backfire spectacularly. Because systems like this assume rational actors. People who care about consequences. People who still believe there's something to protect. But once someone decides there isn't, all bets are off. And that's when the kill switch becomes a liability. Because it doesn't just limit damage. It concentrates it. It ensures that when things finally rupture, they do so violently. Which brings us to a critical inflection point in this story. If Harry's reputation continues to erode under this structure, if he continues to be framed as unstable, unreliable, and emotionally compromised, there may come a moment when he has nothing left to lose. No credibility to preserve. No narrative to protect. No future role to consider. And when that happens, silence stops being an option. The question isn't whether this system can keep him quiet forever. It's whether it can survive the moment he decides not to be quiet at all. Because reputational kill switches work best when the person being constrained still wants to be seen as reasonable. Once that desire evaporates, the switch doesn't kill speech. It detonates it. And when that detonation comes, it won't be contained to one person. It will expose the entire structure that made it necessary in the first place. There's a particular kind of ruin that doesn't arrive as a crisis. No bankruptcy filing. No dramatic foreclosure. No single headline that says it's over. It arrives quietly, disguised as sustainability. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because financial ruin by design doesn't look like collapse. It looks like endurance. It looks like someone staying afloat just well enough that the alarm never sounds, even as the waterline creeps higher. This is where the story stops being emotional altogether and becomes brutally technical. Because if there is one thing contracts are exceptionally good at, it's turning money into behavior. Not through deprivation, through dependency. Harry's situation doesn't resemble someone who ran out of money. It resembles someone who lost control over it. That distinction matters. People imagine financial leverage as a blunt instrument. Cut someone off, starve them out, force compliance. That's crude, and it's rarely effective long-term. Sophisticated leverage works differently. It ensures money flows, just not freely. It keeps income coming, just not independently. It maintains lifestyle, just not security. You're not desperate enough to rebel. You're not comfortable enough to escape. That's the sweet spot. And when you examine Harry's financial trajectory through that lens, the pattern becomes uncomfortably coherent. Consider the nature of his income streams over the past several years. They've been episodic, high-profile, narrative-driven, books, interviews, media deals, all tied, explicitly or implicitly, to a particular version of the story. Once that story loses momentum, once audiences tire, once credibility erodes, the revenue dries up. That's not accidental. Because deals structured around narrative performance are inherently fragile. They require constant emotional output, constant escalation, constant relevance. And when you're contractually constrained in what you can say, when entire chapters of your reality are off limits, sustaining that output becomes impossible. So what happens? You repeat yourself. You recycle trauma. You repackage old grievances. You push harder on diminishing returns. And the audience senses it. Interest wanes. Sympathy evaporates. Credibility cracks, which then feeds back into the financial pressure. This is how ruin becomes self-reinforcing, not through a single loss, but through a narrowing funnel of opportunity. Now let's talk about expenses, because this is where the trap tightens. High-profile legal battles aren't just emotionally draining. They're financially corrosive. Lawyers don't get paid in outcomes. They get paid in time. And time is exactly what drawn-out, unresolved conflicts consume. Every consultation, every filing, every strategy session that leads nowhere. It all bleeds resources without producing leverage. And if you're constrained in how aggressively you can act, if escalation triggers penalties, then you're stuck paying for motion without movement. That's financial attrition. Add to that the cost of maintaining a certain public image, security, staff, PR management, lifestyle expectations. These aren't luxuries when your identity is global. They're requirements. But requirements become burdens when income is unpredictable and autonomous.